Total Fund Portfolio Management Hub. Not because it is easy, but because it is hard. We are launching our pilot Thought Leadership Executive Series. Introduction to Integrated Total Fund Management with Mihail Garchev, former VP and Head of Total Fund Management at BCI. Hosted by Leo Kolivakis, publisher of Pension Pulse.
Good day, everybody. This is Mihail here again. This is now our last week of the introduction to the Integrated Total Fund Management Executive Series. And what follows is our series finale, episode 7. For those of you who are watching the series for the first time or haven't been around for a while, this is a quick look at the topics we are covering in this 7-episode series. With episode 6 last week, we concluded the topic of total fund management implementation. Today, we will be talking about how total fund management could help the next stage of development of the Canadian pension model. In episode 3, for the first time, we introduced the roadmap of the series, which helps us navigate through the wealth of topics already discussed. The roadmap starts with the organizational and investment beliefs, which determine the strategy and the objectives. We discussed both in the first 3 episodes of the series. Over the last 6 weeks, we started exploring how to implement total fund management, and we looked at the framework and the process to underpin the beliefs and the strategy. We illustrated in practice some of the conclusions from the framework and process episodes using 11 engaging studies. And finally, in episode 6, we discussed what is required to turn the framework and process into a capability. Based on the journey so far, we summarized all the conclusions about the organizational and investment beliefs, the corresponding strategies and objectives, and all the 3 aspects of the implementation. But we have yet one more brief to close. While we demonstrated that total fund management could already bring a lot of value to the organization's efficiency and effectiveness, why stop here? Is there anything more, in a way, a next level impact that total fund management could bring? In this episode, we will discuss how implementing TFM might be the foundation to envisioning the further evolution of the Canadian pension model. This all leads us to episode 7. 10 weeks later, we're coming full circle all the way back to episode 1, and for a very good reason. Because episode 1 outlined in detail all the key challenges the Canadian model is currently facing. First, we looked at why total fund has become a priority for most large Canadian pension funds, and we looked at different news announcements about the creation of dedicated functions in some of the large pension funds like CPP, Ontario Teachers, OMERS, and PSP. And we also looked at the key aspects of how these organizations articulate the total fund management function. Dedicated senior executive leadership, key objective of the strategic plan, board and CEO support, key focus is to address size, scale, and efficiency, top-down and cross-asset, looking at short and medium-term capital and risk allocation, as well as liquidity, leverage, currency, and balance sheet management. And then we asked ourselves the logical question, why and why now? And we concluded that there were 3 key reasons: the organizational development, the client evolution, and the external environment. Then we looked at the evolution of the organizations through several stages to present day, and what we saw was that while the funds have built strong and robust organizations, ironically, exactly when the organizations are at their best, they face their biggest challenges as the organizational curve flattens. Because of size, scale, and complexity, the economies of scale these organizations once enjoyed might be plateauing. The second challenge was the client evolution. Client maturity and increased sensitivity to negative outcomes, given their net cash outflows and potential market downturns, may lead to a significant risk of contribution increases. This requires to manage better short and medium-term returns, liquidity, and cost. The third one was the external environment and the lower expected returns going forward. What this means is that returns will be more difficult to achieve, and active management would matter more. But what matters even more are costs, because one thing that is certain is cost versus the uncertainty of returns and active management. The second one was the significant structural changes: disruption, pandemic, ESG, various policies, regulations, the social license to operate. And finally, the increased competition and commoditization of strategies, which challenge the relevance of the model itself. We also discussed two more challenges and the role of total fund management to address these challenges. The first one was the portfolio effectiveness challenge due to the need to manage complexity. So the efficient flow of capital, managing beta, avoiding negative returns, ensuring liquidity and efficient implementation. And the second one was the increasing importance to focus on outcomes instead of reliance on stable asset relationships, which means that there is a need for a more dynamic management of the investment portfolio. So let's summarize again, what challenges are we trying to solve? And look back again in that brief on organizational beliefs. And zoom in at the key challenges again. And it all boils down to these 5 challenges: size, scale, and efficiency, client maturity, external environment, portfolio effectiveness, and increasing focus on outcomes. And throughout the past episodes, we demonstrated that total fund management could address many aspects of these challenges. Let's say we adopt total fund management and implement it as a function. We would expect to gain the second-order efficiencies and extend the organizational curve. But is that the end of its benefit? Could it be that a functional total fund management itself still might not be the ultimate solution in an ever-increasing size and complexity? For example, CPP alone is projected to grow from 400 billion to 1 trillion, and similar growth for some of the other funds. Could size and complexity still overwhelm? Is there anything else we could do to the Canadian pension model? So far in the episodes, we talked how total fund management could create efficiency in certain areas of the pension model, such as decision-making, avoiding hidden cost overlaps, suboptimal decisions, to name a few. Still, there are areas which are related to structure and culture, and as powerful as total fund management is, this is a bigger job. But is it possible that total fund management could have a structural role and impact the model as a whole, not just certain aspects and certain areas of it? This is what we will try to explore in this episode. The starting point to understand this better is understanding what drives the current Canadian model. And what else, from a structural perspective, could total fund management bring to further extend the efficiencies? This brings us to the first topic in today's episode, understanding the Canadian pension model as it is today. Once we understand the model and what brought the success of the model, and given the challenges that we discussed so far, and knowing the benefits of total fund management, then we would possibly be able to formulate whether we could extend the current Canadian model and explore other versions of it. But before we go there, first we want to explore the evolution and the critical success factors of the Canadian model. And then we'll look under the hood, so understand the key characteristics and impacts. Then we'll look at the confluence of right decisions that led to this success. And finally, we'll ask ourselves whether there could be a Minsky moment, or where stability, as it is today, breeds instability. There are a number of great papers on the Canadian model which were published over the last 3 years. More recently, it is the great paper by Clive Lipschitz and Ingo Wolter titled Public Pension Reform and the 49th Parallel, Lessons from Canada for the US, as well as the World Bank paper titled The Evolution of the Canadian Pension Model, Practical Lessons for Building World-Class Pension Organizations, as well as the numerous and, again, great papers by Keith Ambachstier and CEM Benchmarking. My goal is not to repeat all the conclusions in these papers, but really look under the hood of the general conclusions. I will summarize the general conclusions nonetheless for completeness sake in the next slide. What you see on this slide is just the updated version of the World Bank paper, and it gives you the big picture, which most of you already know. So any paper and any topic on the Canadian pension model will talk about these success factors, and rightfully so, because these are really at the core of the Canadian pension model success. First and foremost, joint sponsorship, unified legislation, arm's length, independent governance. Then risk sharing and mandated, most of the time mandated funding of accumulated deficit. Size and scale, certainty of assets, long horizon, in-house management, broad and global diversification, significant focus on private assets, and less regulatory constraints. Of course, talent matters, especially if you have in-house management. So it's top talent, competitive compensation, and importantly, professional management and boards. Another aspect is the ability to pool assets, ability to enter strategic partnerships, and knowledge capital. And finally, the conservative determination in the plan design and the pension funding formulas, and most importantly, the discount rate. And also the fact that contributions and benefit payments are evaluated holistically, so that adjustment of one results in automatic adjustment to the other. So these are some of the main success factors which people, like I said, often describe the Canadian pension model with, and rightfully so. Now that we summarized all the success factors behind the Canadian model, let's now look under the hood and understand what is actually driving this success. So there's one common misperception that Canadian funds are cost efficient. And this is always talked about as a big feature. And it is a feature, but when you look at under the hood at the numbers, so Canadian funds are only marginally cost efficient. They're less than 10% more cost efficient than non-Canadian funds. And then it's important to understand, or to confirm rather, what exactly efficiency means, and then compare it to what the effectiveness is. So efficiency is about doing things right, so completing a task cheaper or faster. Effectiveness, however, is about doing or using the right things, things that yield positive results. So regarding Canadian funds, they are only marginally more cost efficient. So there's a different statement that we'll make next. A more accurate statement would be that Canadian funds, however, have been more effective. So what does this mean? So Canadian funds manage 2 to 3 times more assets internally. And for some of the largest funds, it reaches up to 80%. So what they save from internal management goes back into the capability to manage real assets. So Canadian funds were able to increase the exposure 2 times, double the exposure, and also ability to do more active management and to fund the extra cost to support active management. And then the fact that they saved by doing more internal management allowed them to do a better internal resource allocation. So what's left after doubling or financing the ability to double the exposure in real assets and do more active management, so the rest goes for paying for talent and investing 4 to 5 times more in risk management and systems. So really the core of the Canadian, the core of the success for the Canadian model is this transformation from external to internal management, and then using the savings, so to speak, from the internal management, savings meaning cost, and then putting this cost back into increasing the capability to manage real assets, and then active management, as well as paying for talent and investing more in risk management and systems. So because of this effectiveness, and remember, this is not efficiency, it's effectiveness as we described in the previous slide. So because of this effectiveness, Canadian funds ended up with better returns from real assets so far, plus the ability to manage and deploy leverage. This also leads to potentially better liability hedging assets, and we'll see this a bit later, as well as more well-resourced active management. And finally, better and motivated talent and better risk management and systems in general. Now that we know what was very important for the success outside the undisputable key enablers that we discussed earlier, which are at the macro level, the more governance level of the Canadian funds and the plan designs and all these other elements. So let's look at more specific characteristics of the Canadian funds, which will give us an idea why they were more effective. So first, we're going to look at the asset allocation aspect, and both asset allocation at the policy level and within asset allocation. And when you look at the performance of the Canadian funds, both the policy level allocation and within asset level allocation contribute equally to the success. So at the policy level allocation, what is typical is effectively less equity, more real assets, and less fixed income, but employing leverage. And as it relates to private equity and credit, Canadian funds are no different than most other funds. So this was at the policy level allocation. Now, if we look at the within asset allocation, so the Canadian funds had more global and emerging market equities. They had longer duration bonds and more real assets within the private assets. And by real assets, I mean infrastructure, natural resources, and real estate, as opposed to private equity, which is the majority of private asset holdings for the non-Canadian funds. So having more global and emerging market equity is effectively a result of the push to remove the home bias. So Canadian funds have effectively removed the home bias, or a significant portion of the home bias, as opposed to many other non-Canadian funds, whether US or European or Asia-Pacific ones, which have significantly more home bias. So looking at the real estate and within asset allocation within the real estate, a lot of the benefit came from Canadian real estate. However, there was an effort to shift. There was an effort to reduce the home bias there as well as reduce office and retail and increase residential and industrial. Obviously, this happened over the span of a number of years, but that was initially it was the Canadian aspect that drove the success, and then this shift into reducing Canadian exposure and simultaneously reducing office and retail and increasing residential and industrial. And for infrastructure, although it's a little bit quite diverse there, but generally speaking, it's the focus on midstream and upstream energy, including renewables, reduce the price risk exposure against for more availability payments, and also occasionally some green field projects, but not much. Another key differentiator is the use of leverage. Typically, it would be between 15 and 40%, with some of the funds which employ liability-driven investing or form of it, it could be between 50 and or well over 200%. And this is, of course, in contrast to the 5-10% on average, which is used by non-Canadian funds. The Canadian funds have more, or typically more long-term, use more long-term leverage, medium-term notes specifically, but also commercial paper as well as a lot of use of repos, as well as portable alpha and recourse and non-recourse leverage in real assets as well. So leverage in general has been accretive to both the bonds, and especially in the case of LDI, as well as the assets, given the positive returns and the low rates. And of course, the cost of leverage here factors in as well. So because it just helped on both ends, leverage contributed around 1% of so leverage added around 1% of the total return on leverage across the funds. So another important aspect is the liquidity, because ultimately, and you recall from episode 1 when we were talking about the efficient portfolio management and the flow of capital. So liquidity is really what allows you to invest in private assets. And when we talk about liquidity, we're talking about liquidity which is a sustainable liquidity which you could always have, even if there is a crisis, not necessarily any manufactured liquidity through short-term leverage or things like this. So liquidity allowed the Canadian funds to invest in these private asset classes, and specifically even in real assets. And if you take infrastructure, for example, you could have very long-term investments there, much longer than typical private equity investment. So this liquidity was a very important aspect, and so what's coming is effectively that in the next 4 or 5 years, we would see a point break where the total contributions would equal the outflows, and then they're gonna decline from there on. So this means that effectively over the next 4 or 5 years, and probably years after, this may slow or even reduce the private asset exposure and other liquid asset exposures, because this liquidity, this sustainable liquidity, as I call it, will not be there anymore. So there will be a form of de-risking, if you wish, of these funds going forward, because you no longer can sustain these levels of private assets given the liquidity. So this is probably another misconception, but size was not a major driver to the risk-adjusted performance. That said, size is part of the efficiency, and size is part of the ability to to invest in these real assets. And while size initially may have led to efficiency, at certain point, the cost efficiency curve effectively flattens. All of the reasons are related to the size, scale, and complexity of the organizations. So there are many costs that may have not been captured, which are embedded in the returns or might be higher going forward, such as the costs related to the organizational challenge, or this principal agent costs, as often are described in literature. But they're all these costs related to the organizational challenge that we discussed back in episode 1 and in the beginning of this episode, as well as costs related to external scrutiny, oversight, regulation, reputational issues, social license to operate. So all these costs, they pile up, outside the investment costs and the need for new systems and things like this. So all these costs pile up. At the same time, so far they've been masked to a certain extent by the good returns. But if these returns are not the same going forward, then it could be a case for these returns not being the same going forward. This would uncover the importance of these costs. And the truth is that nobody knows what these costs could be. I mean, it requires a proper cost framework and benchmarking. And also benchmarking to the path not taken, because it's very easy to not to account for something that you could have done, and then the cost doesn't matter. The opportunity cost doesn't matter because nobody is measuring it, nobody is looking at it. So we'll talk about these costs a little bit later, but this is just getting back to the conclusion, at least looking from the numbers, that size is not a major driver to the risk-adjusted performance, and size matters to the extent that it allows investing in the real assets, and was very helpful to a certain point in the organizational development where these economies of scale, because this is effectively what it is, it's the economies of scale that these funds enjoyed in the beginning, but right now they probably are flattening across the board. And a final note, looking at some of the small Canadian pension funds of 10 billion and less, they effectively run the Canadian Model 1.0 light version. So they follow very similar path as the larger funds, and they're only 5 or 10% less effective than the larger brethren. So for them, what's typical is that they have more in-house public equities, more real assets, same as the large funds, less hedge funds, and very similar asset allocations to the large funds. So given the Canadian model characteristics, many right decisions were made, and independent governance, talent, and proper incentives undoubtedly contributed to the success. So what were some of the right decisions? So the first one is the most important one, was the right decision to internalize the assets. And reinvest the benefit into real asset capability, supporting talent, risk systems, and building the foundation for more active management across all assets. So this was one of the big decisions. The second one was not only to create the real asset capability or the ability to manage real assets, being talent and networking with partners and engaging with partners, but also move capital to the real assets. And it's one thing to have the capability, so have a team and knowledge and things like this, but to move capital in real assets, it requires proper networking, proper sourcing, for you to be recognized as the first call of partners, and the ability on top of this to manage these assets, because once you buy them, then comes the asset management and what you do with these assets, especially certainly in direct investments. And many of these real assets, in many cases, could be direct investments in companies, as well as funds for that matter as well. So, but the right decision to move capital and move capital quickly to the real assets. And this pays so because of this move toward globalization, which was certainly over the last 10 to 15 years, it's been there. The low yields and the quest for yield actually drove the valuation of these assets quite a bit. So just for example, the valuation in infrastructure a year ago was so everybody was looking for this yield and cash flow in the infrastructure. So in many cases, while the regulatory, because these are, at least looking at the regulated assets, the regulatory cost of capital, let's say in UK, depending on the type of asset, but let's say it would be around 7%, and that would be the regulatory cost of capital. But then these assets will be traded like 50 to 60% premium, and they will be bought at 4.5%, 5% cost of capital. So this just shows you the amount of valuation that went into these assets. And of course, when you're at the right time, this helps the performance significantly. And also the right decisions within the asset allocation. What I mean is within the real estate and infrastructure, and moving away from Canada, like I mentioned, in real estate, moving away from office and retail and moving more toward industrials and residential. So the next big decision was to reduce the home bias altogether, not only in real estate, but also in equities particularly. And again, there was this confluence of the impact of globalization in global and emerging markets as well. And the last big decision, I would say, would be the decision to introduce leverage. And this is because all assets have positive returns and the cost of borrowing was low, so leverage helped significantly. And in certain cases also, it's not only the fact that there was leverage, but also that leverage in some instances was managed dynamically and, increasing and decreasing the level of leverage depending on market circumstances, as well as efficient implementation. What type of leverage, again, whether recourse, non-recourse, was the source of it, maturity, and things like this. So these were, I would say, probably the four key decisions that created the effectiveness of the Canadian pension funds. Again, there's a difference between efficiency and effectiveness. And like we said, efficiency is about completing a task cheaper or faster, while effectiveness is about doing the right things that yield positive results, not necessarily cheaper or faster. The alignment of the right decisions led to significant improvement in the pension fund sustainability in general. So the funding status of the Canadian funds, of the large Canadian funds, improved by an absolute 10 to 15%, with most of the large funds in a surplus position. So funding ratios are better because of conservative rules to start with, and the initial typically mandated funding, and the better returns, of course, but also because most liabilities have inflation indexation or this cost of living adjustment. So inflation indexation is more sensitive to the real rate and growth. So the ability to invest in assets which have high cash flow profile, but also embedded growth in them, like infrastructure, real estate, private credit as well, produces better liability matching and current cash flow. And this liability matching, you can think about it as in a way, a quasi-LDI, which uses these features of the real assets. And then, of course, you add leverage on top of this and positive returns, so you get this really stars aligning on that front as well. So given all the stars aligning and everything going seemingly well for the Canadian funds, could there be a Minsky moment for them? Or could it be that there is that stability actually breeds instability? And this is, of course, these thoughts are inspired by the theory of Hyman Minsky, who unfortunately died in 1996 and never saw the actual crisis that confirmed his thoughts, but his theory is widely accepted these days, and effectively this notion of stability that breeds instability relates to this period of steady prosperity and investment gains, which encourage diminished perception of overall market risk and complacency. And at least in the case of his theory, it's and which we actually saw in the global financial crisis, this promotes this leverage risk of, borrowing money and investing with leverage instead of cash. And this, of course, piles up. And if there is a cash flow crisis, which typically could begin with a short-term modest decline of assets, but then it spirals because the cash generated by the assets is no longer sufficient to pay off the debt used to acquire the assets, and so there are losses on these speculative positions, and lenders call their capital. Then the leverage position needs to be closed, and this further amplifies itself into much lighter decline and eventually collapse in asset values. And it's linked to the degree of leverage in the market as well, and their liquidity positions and things like this. So this is, of course, more market related, but when I was thinking about this Minsky moment and stability breeds instability, I was thinking more about the organizational development and the organizational challenges, if you wish. Because ultimately, think about it, even the market-related, they're ignited by market events, but underneath is effectively this complacency and this diminished perception of overall risk, which promotes the type of behavior. So I was thinking about this possible Minsky moment, which is created by this seeming stability and kind of organizational comfort, if you wish, and then it's suddenly a market or some other event, for that matter, could actually create such a spiraling down. I've tried to illustrate this in this graphic where you have time and you have the organizational development curve through time, and then on the y-axis you have the size, scale, and complexity vector as well. And then you have these different stages of the organizational development. And we talked about more such stages, but I've kind of aggregated them into three major ones. And as we discussed in episode 1, it starts with this kind of entrepreneurship spirit and building up the organization and growth and things like this. Then what follows is the sustained organizational growth. And then the organization kind of reaches the peak of the organizational curve, which is arguably something that we might be observing today. And this is where you have this, these organizational challenges that we talked about, and this principal agent conflict acceleration, as I called it. Because ultimately a lot of these organizational challenges are driven by the principal agent conflict that exists. So what are the interests of the agents versus, and agents of course being the employees and the management of the organization, versus the principals who would be the beneficiaries. And so, we talked already about these. We'll talk in a bit as well. So you're reaching at this point, and you have this organizational challenge problem. And then, at the same time, you're facing the external challenges, as we discussed them, the client evolution and the external environment. So if you get kind of the and these accelerating in one way or another, this could be actually easily could develop into a Minsky moment one way or another. And again, what I'm talking about here is the combination of internal structural and cultural, I would say, aspect of the organizational challenge, which is on the left-hand side of it, and then it's faced by the client evolution challenge and the external environment. And I was thinking about it, and if we think about the ABCP debacle and some of the Canadian funds, I think this is a good example of them having this minor Minsky moment, because some of the reasons behind some of the ABCP and some other aspects, which I don't want to really go into detail right now. But the challenge there was not necessarily because of pure market exposures, or certainly not as benchmark market exposures, but the real challenge was driven by this principal-agent conflict, where agents had an interest in doing one thing and did a lot of it, and suddenly market conditions changed, and this change was just accelerated more and more and more, and linked to this mini Minsky moment, if you wish. And who knows, next time there might be more billions at stake. And for sure, things have evolved since then, both on the positive side, being experience, risk management, and things like this. But also the organizations have evolved themselves. They became bigger, more complex, and complexity also brings fragility. And there's a whole different topic, which probably is very, very pertinent here. And if I had more time, probably I would have looked into this as well. But again, the organizations are much larger, much more complex, both as investment strategies, but also as human interactions and human and kind of principal-agent conflict. And this coupled with market circumstances or some other circumstances that could lead to this Minsky moment. I will now bring this slide, which is a summary of some of the things we've been talking in episode 1, but it's really a very good summary of this principal-agent conflict acceleration. And I'll just go quickly through it. So, like we mentioned, while the funds have built strong and robust organizations, ironically, exactly when the organizations are at their best, they face their biggest challenges, and the organizational curve flattens. Unfortunately, significant size and scale come with overlaps in functions and activities, different centers of gravity, communication challenges, the proverbial hearing but not listening, lack of proximity, and sometimes lack of clear vision. Culture becomes a problem. Many things are self-centered and focused on keeping importance, keeping the function and the benefits that come with it. Internal politics and inertness. Additional reasons are the increased external scrutiny, oversight, regulation, reputational issues, social license to operate. In some instances, even one might argue that there's no external challenge to renew because the clients are generally captive. Following the expansive build-up phase of laying the investment engine's foundation based on strategic asset allocation and building the investment groups, the initial economies of scale may now have been reaching a plateau. So while everything is functioning in a very optimal manner within the asset classes and the operations, and the engine itself runs very optimally, it's not the engine that becomes a problem, it's the car itself. And so at this point, its success in serving the client's ultimate purpose is no longer critically dependent on the engine. Although one wants to make sure the engine never stalls, it is now critically reliant on whoever is driving the car, or whether they have a good navigation map and a clear plan of how quickly and safely arrive at the destination. So I think this slide, although we've talked already about this a couple of times actually, I think this very well describes this importance of differentiating between the engine, so what's being built, which is very robust, as operations, as processes and things like this, versus which is the engine, versus the car and the people who drive the car, which there is this. It's not a mechanical issue, if you wish. It's not an engineering or mechanical problem at this point. It's a human problem, and it's everything that happens in very large human organizations. And that's as you would see, and you probably already guessed, is a cultural problem. So there's a reason why so many people or these organizations actually focus a lot on culture these days. So it's a cultural problem. It's not a mechanical engineering problem at this point. So let me give you some examples of these, human challenges and this principal agent conflict through the purely human challenges and cultural challenges, and the potentially increasing cost of this principal agent conflict. And these are hypothetical examples, and what I mean by cost is not only cost as direct cost, but also cost of wrong decisions and everything else that might create less effectiveness for the funds going forward. So these are small examples, but you can think of these examples there are many versions of it, and they can accumulate, and at some point, these small things can accumulate to something much bigger and much less, something that could destabilize organizations in general. So the first example, I call it a governance cost, and it's related to one of the case study number 6, which we had in the second part of episode 2. So it's an example when the agent's self-interest outweighs the client interest. So this was the case study on balance sheet decisions. And for those of you who watched the episode and remember this case, it was this decision and the trade-off between earning 180 basis points of risk-free alpha for the agent versus a potential 10-15% negative return for the principal, the client, the beneficiary. So in this case, it's a typical principal-agent conflict to start with, but also this is a question of governance, incentives, attribution, and benchmarking. So these are some of the things that could actually manage such governance cost. But this cost exists, but nobody really knows what it is, as well many other costs that I'm talking about. So the second one, I call it internal politics cost. And so the example here is if a less competent person, for example, takes place for whatever reasons, then what usually happens is, so this less competent person rushes to hire more people to do the job, and as well more external advisors, and both to compensate the competence and productivity challenge that's being created by kind of wrong hiring, if you wish. So this also might spiral even more, where some other competent people might leave due to the declining morale. And this ultimately ends up in actual cost and probably suboptimal decisions down the road as well. So this is just another kind of human element which actually spirals into many other implications. The next example, I call it a complacency cost. So when culture changes so that the agent's motivation, primary driver, is not efficiency, effectiveness, and constant improvement in the interest of the client, but kind of the culture changes in the organization toward more preserving the position, the sphere of interest and influence, the benefit that comes with it for as long as it's possible. And again, we all know about the pensions, the bonuses, the benefits. So, everything is centered around preserving what I have, not being the best I can. And, efficiency and effectiveness, in fact, ironically, might be threatening the job, and certainly in certain cases even exposing competence. So ironically, efficiency and effectiveness, whether it's automation of functions or whatever, but ironically it actually creates resistance instead of being a thing that everybody wants, which might not be the case. So also there's no external challenge. So why strive for all these things? And what this leads is effectively people engaging more in internal politics to protect their center of gravity. So this is just another, I call it a complacency cost, but it has so many other implications beyond just direct costs, but many other implications. The last one, I call it the herd mentality cost. So let's say everybody pursues a hypothetical investment strategy because there is a belief and not necessarily evidence of a proven risk premium that it would produce superior returns. So what happens if this does not materialize? So let's say the thesis was wrong initially, or too much money were chasing the same thing and only benefits those who were first. So this now gets back to this way, to this discussion earlier, that there is also an opportunity cost. And if one does not consider the path not taken, in a way, it's kind of, this cost doesn't exist because nobody measures it. There's no alternative. So, this leads to people engaging in strategies because of other reasons rather than necessarily the very reason of producing superior returns. And even if these were wrong, there's no relevant benchmark, if you wish, of the path not taken. So it's okay, it doesn't exist. So these were just a few examples, and I'm sure everybody can think of many, many others of these, but I just was trying to kind of give some flavor of how this human behavior really escalates to this principal-agent conflict, and this stability, or at least on the surface, actually breeds instability in the organizations. Uncolonies are the most studied social phenomenon, as they strikingly resemble human order interactions and hierarchy. So ant wars is actually a sociobiology term. They're actually real. And when not faced with external competition from another colony, ants can start a war within. Does this sound familiar to the organizations which do not have external challenge to renew? So total fund management is a powerful lever. So total fund management as a function, and combined with governance, which is around everything around decisions, attribution, benchmarking, to name a few. So both of them combined, they could do the heavy lifting and solve quite a few of the issues that we've discussed, both structural issues, but also market-related challenges, the external environment, the client as well, and of course inefficiencies within the organization. But many of the remaining issues are cultural. So this is why, as I mentioned, we see so many efforts of the organizations on culture. But culture is difficult to change because an organization's culture is deeply embedded in the system and is therefore extremely difficult to change. That's because an organization's culture comprises an interlocking set of goals, roles, processes, values, communication practices, attitudes, and assumptions. So in a way, even with the examples earlier, you see that it's not just one-sided aspect. It's just so intertwined and it's so difficult to untangle, if you wish. Culture is an important topic in the organizations, and we see all these initiatives, working groups, value statements in the organizations. And even one can see at this tug of war, if you wish, when looking at LinkedIn and Glassdoor, for example, and there's quite a difference. So you see on the one side, all these constant parade of virtuous cultural messages and, nice pictures and statements and value statements of all kinds. But at the same time, you see this undertow, behind the quiet waters, if you wish, of the real culture that's in the organizations. And this is something that's there, regardless of whether we've been bombarded with value statements on LinkedIn, for example. So if it is true that culture is difficult to change because it's deeply embedded in the system, then how about if we change the system, or by extension, the structure itself? Could it be that any efforts to change culture, again, through initiatives, working groups, value statements, embedding in scorecards and performance evaluations and things like this, maybe there's a structural reason for being very difficult to change the culture, because these organizations, again, they become very large, very complex. So it's all these efforts on culture could only bring so much. Not even to mention that sometimes even culture could be weaponized for, again, ironically, to serve internal politics reasons and things like this. So it kind of, defeats the whole purpose of it. So how about if we've reached this peak of what we could do with all these cultural initiatives, and maybe it's time to actually change the structure itself. And there's a reason for this relationship between culture and structure, and we'll see next. So what is it about culture and structure? So think about it. You could put good people in the wrong environment and leadership, and they start to behave the wrong way. And probably soldiers in a war where there are atrocities and certainly evil leaders. I mean, it's a good example of this. I mean, the soldiers themselves are probably not bad people. They're probably good people, just put in an absolute situation of war and atrocities, and certainly by the wrong leaders as well. So they start to behave in the wrong way, and themselves being part of these atrocities. So leadership alone might not solve the culture challenge if it's confined by the very environment and structure. So there's a point from which on you cannot do much more about it. So at this point, changing the structure would be the most powerful incentive for people to change behaviors and ultimately the organizations to transform the culture. So you put good people in the wrong environment, actually scratch this, in the right environment. So you put good people in the right environment to leadership, and they start to behave the right way. So what are some of the things that we might like to change as part of this culture change? So I'm sure I'm missing some of these, but I've kind of listed some of the thoughts that I had. So it's the clarity and proximity of purpose. It's the entrepreneurial spirit. It's the competency and performance first. It's the flexibility and agility. It's the innovation and creativity. It's the cost consciousness, the communication and ability to reduce overlaps. Also, the ability to monetize the business model, because there's a lot of value in this business model which could be further actually monetized, which would help the whole cost and efficiency aspect. Also, one might want to kind of reduce unnecessary scrutiny and all the cost, time and cost and effort that goes with it. And of course, in these things, within these things are also intertwined collaboration and cooperation, all these things. So these are some of the things that we would aspire to as part of the change in the culture aspect, but also some business related changes as well. And of course, one wants to preserve all the current benefits as well. So if we're kind of to group all these, I've grouped them into three major things, which is entrepreneurship and competitiveness, efficiency and effectiveness, and innovation and creativity. And by and large, you could kind of fit most of these within these categories. And then the question becomes, could we do something and change the structure of the Canadian model somehow, so that we could renew and restore these these qualities that we aspire to. Let's have a second look at the organization and its structure. So this is how we think organizations work. So this is the functional form or structure of an organization, and I've just arbitrarily named these boxes as typical functions. But how it actually works is a cross-functional informal structure. So functions in an organizational chart do not tell us how people actually work. All organizations have a hidden informal network of interactions to get work done. So far too many organizations actually ignore these structures, the complexity of work and the surrounding environment, and just they go with these verticals, vertical organizational charts. But there is this ongoing battle between efficiency and entrepreneurship and innovation. And in this ongoing battle, many organizations believe that they can just do one or the other. And, this organizational curve flattens, and that's a fact of life. And we can, do something to push it a little bit, but culture and whatnot, but that's pretty much it. But there is a way to simultaneously do both. And that's really where I'm going with this discussion, how we could apply this natural element of entrepreneurship and innovation in the context of the Canadian pension model. So a few thoughts on the organizational design given these three outcomes that we've identified. So no matter which human resource book you read, being a great company is about people, outcome, and purpose. And these are pretty much related to the three key elements that we've identified, because these three key elements bring and renew and make the company great. So it's the ability to be entrepreneurial and innovative and allow people to learn and grow professionally in the proper environment. It's about having a great product, having a great outcome. So people are, everybody's on board and united and working together as one team to produce this outcome. And finally, it's the purpose as well. So if we look at our three key elements of three traits of the great organization, and look at this continuum from efficiency to innovation and creativity, we could come up with these three notions about shared services, knowledge and expertise, and these cross-functional pools, if you wish, which we kind of showed up through the informal network effect. So let's, and these of course could be also internal and external. So let's kind of further develop this graphic. The next slide. So by changing the structure, we effectively would be changing the culture. So structure really matters and how the organization is structured. So again, this is a different way to look at the structure beyond just the organizational charts, that the verticals that we've seen by functions, verticals by functions. So in this graphic, you see now the shared services pools, which, if you recall, the color coding, the light blue was operations, the green was, anything that's risk, research, kind of middle office functions, and the dark blue would be investment functions. So the shared services pools are effectively and mostly comprised of operations and maybe some middle office individuals. The knowledge and expertise pools, these would be separate functions that are there on demand, if you wish. And then you have the cross-functional pools, which are all gathered around delivering a particular outcome. And it could be comprised of both investment, total fund management, as well as middle office and maybe operations as well. So now you have this kind of three different structures within the organization, which go through this continuum from efficiency and effectiveness, which is the shared services concept, toward innovation and creativity, which is the cross-functional, outcome-oriented structure, and something that helps both functions with expertise, which is the knowledge and expertise pools. So let's develop and let's look at one more step, look at some specific characteristics these elements of the organizational structure. So here now you have the description and the example and what is it designed for. These three kind of nucleus of organizational, structural units. So the shared services type is, so these are centralized dedicated teams, transaction oriented, well-defined functions and automation. And these would be traditional functions like finance, legal, payroll, HR. And again, these could be internal or external. And, in certain cases, even HR, for that matter, one might argue it could be actually external and keep it very independent. This would definitely help a lot the culture. And so what this structure is designed for is high efficiency. It's goal-specific execution and operational tasks. So this is really targeted toward efficiency. Now the knowledge and expertise pool. These are highly specialized experts, and they are on demand. They temporarily collaborate with other teams to add knowledge, and it's just they're subject matter experts, data scientists, for example, who provide insights across the organizations depending on the needs. And so they're project specific, and they have kind of adapt to the situation. And finally, you have the dedicated and decentralized teams grouped around delivering a specific outcome, which are collaborative, multidisciplinary, and have autonomous decision making. And so these are mission specific. It's concentrated both the innovation but also the entrepreneurial aspect of the organization. Now that we've looked at these different organizational structure elements, let's now envision possible organizational models which we could apply to the Canadian pension model. So the first model is, I call it the Canadian Model 2.0 light version, and I call it the horizontal scorecard. And the idea here is that most of the organizations have not only this vertical organizational structure, but also some form of a vertical scorecard, which, there are tasks, objectives, goals, and they all go vertical through different levels up to the leader of the particular group. So if we borrow from the organizational elements of the organizational structure that we just looked at, then we could probably formulate a different type of structure where you have a horizontal scorecard. So what I'm talking about here is, again, I'm bringing back, and throughout these models, the idea here is that whenever I talk about an outcome, these outcomes are related to the outcomes when we were describing in episode 1. And I kind of briefly, that's why we had the flashback in the beginning of this episode. But by outcomes, what's meant is, managing, for example, wealth, managing inflation, managing liquidity, managing risk mitigation, for example. So these elements of the outcome-oriented asset allocation and portfolio management. So not asset classes, but outcomes themselves. So this is really what I mean here. But of course, you can relate this to any outcome for that matter. And so the goal, of course, is not only to discuss these type of possible models, but also the role of total fund management. And in all of these cases, total fund management supports the CIO, but also total fund management is, in a way, managing the outcomes themselves in different roles, but it's effectively this kind of a conductor role, if you wish, to manage the outcomes. But the outcomes themselves are delivered in different forms from different kind of substructures. So let's kind of quickly look at this example. It's probably going to get clearer. So you have the typical structure with the CEO, and you have the senior executives, whatever they are, HR, operations, and then you have the CIO as well. And like I said, the CIO is supported by the total fund management function, all this framework, process, capability that we discussed in the earlier episodes. So what is what total fund and the CIO and the total fund management function is managing is effectively managing a portfolio of outcomes. So imagine you have these cross-functional pools, groups of people, if you wish, and each one of these cross-functional teams manages separate outcome. And again, these are cross-functional. These are not, so they could have different people from different backgrounds. So these are really, they're managing the outcomes within the overall organization. And then you have already the two other elements that we had, which is shared services pools, which is providing all the operational support, and as well these specific knowledge and expertise pools, these individuals with expertise who could provide expertise to the different cross-functional pools as required on demand. So this is kind of the horizontal scorecard. So you remove this notion of managing verticals or managing asset classes, but rather you're managing horizontally, and you're managing outcomes. So here I'm just describing what I've already said. So this is different from the vertical scorecards. One could instead define strategic or pension sustainability goals as outcomes, assign these outcomes to multidisciplinary teams. So the success of these teams relies on successfully delivering the outcomes. So have the CIO via the total fund management function manage the outcomes toward the ultimate purpose. And like I said, this links together with the notion of outcomes, outcome-oriented portfolio management, and the role of the total fund management function. So the next example is a model which I call the holding company. So effectively, now you have a split in the company. So you have, all the previous asset classes are carved out, and now they become separate companies. And the pension, the pension fund becomes a holding company, and it's effectively managed by the CEO and the CIO via the total fund management function. So the key aspect here is that one creates this notion of internal market for capital. So all these separate companies now compete for capital. So this creates this competitive entrepreneurship aspect. At the same time, they all have their own functions within the individual companies. So whether it's operations or middle office, in addition to the investment people. And there's this proximity that's being created and built for purpose, if you wish. So it talks to the efficiency. At the same time, you could still have shared services, which are much smaller, and an example of such service could be custodial services or things like this, which could also be linked to the various asset class companies. And you still have innovation and knowledge. because typically innovation requires collaboration. It doesn't require competition. So once the innovation is there, then competition values it and bids it out. But to create innovation, one needs collaboration, not necessarily competition. So any innovation still needs to be within the kind of the holding company. And so you could also have, as part of this internal market for capital and the competition in general, you could have external companies as well being competitors as part of this process. And finally, you could have external clients. So the individual asset class companies effectively manage third-party money. And the benefit of this is that any fees that come with it, they flow back to the beneficiaries, which gets back to the efficiency and the costs. So this is kind of the holding company structure. So this structure is effectively taking a step further from what already exists in some of the funds, where there are separate, for example, real estate and infrastructure companies like Quadrio, Ivanhoe, Cambridge, Cadillac, Fairview, Borealis, to name a few. So the CIO manages all the required outcomes based on the building blocks from the asset companies. So the asset companies compete for capital, and there's this internal market concept, but also there could be external companies as well. So there's this competition, and the CIO might choose, the most competitive offering. So this, by definition, would create this strive for excellence within the companies. Operations, like I mentioned, are brought back to proximity within the asset companies. And there could be shared services like custodian. And because of this different structure, now we have one more degree of separation. So at least initially, you'll have less scrutiny and potentially, less regulations, which of course could change with time. Like I said, innovation needs cooperation, not competition. So there should be part of, so any innovation type of activity should be part of the holding company, but also it could create value for the asset companies as well, because it has this proximity, but also the innovation could create new asset companies and kind of spawn new asset companies as well. And finally, it's this ability to monetize the business model. Like I mentioned, there's a lot of value in these business models. And if there is a structure like this, so the asset companies could manage third-party money, and these could be, external clients could be smaller funds or, international pension funds who give money, or any other capital for that matter, and the fees flow back as income to the pension beneficiaries. So these are just some examples of, how to think about this structure. I call the third model baby funds. So in a way, it's similar to the holding company, but instead of having different asset class-based companies, you split the whole fund into different baby funds. So these funds, they could be either carbon copies of one another, or themselves, they could self-regulate themselves into a different structure. For example, in this case, we have two more traditional and one more the horizontal scorecard type of structure. So in this case, again, there's this internal market for capital. So there's competition between the three funds. So this naturally creates, so not only capital, but also, compensation and things like this. They all be based on who's best and, who provides the best outcomes. And again, the CIO and the total fund management has this role of orchestrating, if you wish, what comes out of these baby funds. And again, you could have shared services and innovation, and something very important as well. You could have external clients as well who invest in the baby funds, and this way you monetize the business model as well. So again, very quickly, so the baby funds are carbon copies of the original fund. So they're self-organizing and could choose any organizational model they prefer. So they compete for capital in this internal market. The CIO allocates capital to the baby funds in a similar way one would allocate capital to external managers. The CIO, however, still manages the outcomes and manages using the total fund management function. So, for example, the baby funds could attract third-party money. So, I mean, one way to do this would be to issue some form of performance-linked medium-term notes, and as part of, for example, raising leverage and things like this, and pay the return of the baby fund on these notes. And again, this is the ability to monetize the business model, and the fees flow back as income to pension beneficiaries. And this is actually, both this one and the previous model. It's a way, and there certainly would be demand because there are a lot of funds outside Canada, but even probably small Canadian funds who probably could benefit from this ability to to participate in a pool of capital without necessarily the legal aspects of it. And certainly this could be a way, for example, for US funds, and it's a huge market, 4 trillion or so. So a lot of capital actually could be directed this way for people who otherwise cannot build these capabilities. And so that's a great way to actually monetize the business model. So the next model is, I've called it outcome funds or fund companies, to be more correct. So it's, in a way, it's a crossbreed between, actually it's not a crossbreed necessarily, but instead of having, for example, in the holding company example, we had the asset classes being, spun out as separate companies. In this case, you create separate companies. However, they're based on the outcomes themselves. And remember, the key outcomes for the pension sustainability and the whole total fund management process was managing toward these outcomes. So you can think of, and that's what I've illustrated here, the wealth, the inflation, risk mitigation, and liquidity. So these are companies that specifically manage to these outcomes, and they have their own investment policies and requirements and things like this, which are given from the CIO and the total fund management function. But these are not competing for capital, and that's different from the holding level. So they are given very specific required outcomes. And again, by doing this, you're still creating this kind of more focus toward this entrepreneurial aspect and proximity of operations, because now you have specific budgets and the required outcomes as well. And again, the shared services and the innovation could be there as well. So the outcome funds, like I mentioned, are still self-regulating companies. So capital is captive and allocated as per the CIO and the total fund management function. So there's no competition for capital. But however, there could be competing external outcome managers to the extent, such mandates could be structured A, and B, there's sufficient scale to such mandates. The benefits here is the clarity of mandate, explicit objectives, priorities, measure of success. So efficiency is captured explicitly via cost per outcome. So there's no hiding and diluting of the results into vague and unclear statements and maybe convoluted measurement and reporting communication. So, because of the outcome separation, the inefficiencies of the size and scale are addressed. And also, like I mentioned, there's this proximity of operations to the function, which creates additional efficiency. So let's evaluate the four models based on the earlier criteria. So I've created this comparison chart based on the criteria that we talked about. Again, there could be other criteria as well. I just use these. And they're all ranked based on, compared to the baseline, which is the current version, and looking at, what creates a better and best outcome, given, the structure of the model. So I didn't know, honestly, I didn't know which one would turn most green. It turns out that it's the holding company that it is, and I don't know whether this is right or wrong, but that's how I kind of evaluated based on my thoughts around how the structure would address the benefits that we want to create. So this is just to give a visual idea. And of course, anybody could have a different ranking around these. So again, these are just some initial thoughts to initiate a discussion. But what's important that in all these potential models, total fund management plays a central structural role to assist the CIO in the ability to actually manage these different structures in a way that's somewhat different from the current practice. So this brings us to the summary takeaways from today's last episode, actually. So these summary takeaways, in a way, also reflect the overall serious takeaways as well. So they're kind of embedded in them. So I'll go through these as well. So the Canadian model, as we know it, is only marginally efficient. Its strength is in the effectiveness or the ability to align many right decisions to achieve the right outcomes. But the increasing challenges might put to the test this past effectiveness and challenge the efficiency. The functional role of total fund management, so what we saw, framework, process, capability, can address many of the challenges related to size, scale, and efficiency, client maturity, and external environmental challenge, portfolio effectiveness, and increasing focus on outcomes. But many of the challenges are related to structure and culture, and ultimately result in less efficiency or some form of a cost, and less effectiveness, or coming to the right outcomes. So culture might be difficult to change and might require to rethink the structure. Focusing on entrepreneurship and competitiveness, innovation and creativity ultimately leads to restoring the efficiency and effectiveness. The current strengths and benefits of the Canadian model could be further extended by adopting structures which could significantly increase its future potential, and total fund management plays a critical role in this. So this concludes our episode, and not only our episode, but our series as well. So I would like to thank you all for following Leo's blog over the last 10 weeks, and all your support, comments, and insights. Thank you again, and stay safe.
Total Fund Portfolio Management Hub. Not because it is easy, but because it is hard. Thank you, and see you at the Pension Pulse blogspot.